Electa Tritsch. Welcome to Tracks in Time. This time, we're going to explore a literal track, the route of the Framingham and Lowell Railroad. There hasn't been a train on this line for over 3 decades, but the railway still has been busy in the slow and sometimes painful process of reimagining itself as the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. Joining me for this episode, sometimes on screen, always trying to keep the story honest, is Henry Keutmann. Henry, who lives in Concord, is widely known for his inexhaustible knowledge of railroad history. I want to know how you started being interested in railroads.
Like so many of us, when I was a kid, I got an electric train for Christmas. I was captivated by the motion and the colorful cars and such. And but as time went on, I realized that there was much more to learn from looking at the real thing. In terms of the impact of the railroad on the history of our country and our communities.
This is part of Henry's private railroad collection. It is the case for a 6-pack of Concord Junction Porter from a microbrewery, and on the end is the crossing sign. Is that what that's called?
Yeah, crossing marker.
Yeah, I'm learning. So let us find out what we can about Framingham and Lowell and its transformation in the 21st century, 20th and 21st century. On one end, our story begins at a train depot in Lowell, just north of the pastoral-sounding South Common, just south of the seriously industrial Pawtucket Power Canal. Today, the site of the depot is directly under a highway cloverleaf. We won't find much of history or recreation there. We have to go to the edge of Lowell itself to reliably find our railroad amid all the main lines, branch lines, freight sidings, coal houses, depots, storage sheds that filled the railroad yards in eastern cities by the late 1800s. The Framingham and Lowell, inaugurated in 1871, was a latecomer to the region, but a very important one. It was the first direct north-south route through central Massachusetts. It provided access and opportunity to all the towns and industries beyond the urban core, as well as a new form of passenger transportation significantly more comfortable and, sometimes at least, more reliable than the stagecoaches. Let's just start where the planners of the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail began in 1987. This unprepossessing parking lot at Cross Point Towers, with its casual signage and community notices, leads directly to a bit of magic. On a workday at noon, the trail is reasonably busy. People stretching their legs during their lunch hours. The echo, of course, is because I'm standing under Route 3, which is a little disconcerting. All along the way, there are unexpected finds. Remnants of railroad history intriguing in their obscurity. A skinny tree turns out on closer inspection to be an abandoned telegraph pole. Beside a busy street, an innocuously stenciled post turns out to be a railroad mile marker. 3 miles from Lowell, 23 miles to go to Framingham. The trail makes its way between office buildings and shops. The old town hall, the common, the classic New England church. It's a busy place today with a lot of crossing roads. Crossroads partially explain why the train station was here as well. Today, what's left of the Framingham and Lowell line, besides the trail we're walking on, is an antique store that was once the freight depot. There can be little question here that the trail as alternative transportation route is a major addition. That was part of the original vision of Chelmsford Representative Bruce Freeman, who led the charge to make this bike trail happen. It's not surprising to see a rail trail wander through farmland. On the other hand, it's a bit disconcerting to see it wander off under the high-tension lines. In fact, it's not so unusual, though. Frequently, the utility companies bought up rights-of-way or shared rights-of-way with railroads, and the environment that they maintain, the mixed brushland, is a beautiful place to walk. Not much farther beyond the transmission lines, we get to the Pond Street intersection, and that's where a whole new landscape opens up. Cars gently crossing to get to a parking lot for Hart Pond, a very neighborhood place to swim. It has a tiny swimming area, no amenities to speak of. Through much of Chelmsford, the trail is defined by post and rail fencing. It's heavy duty, keeps you from falling off the edges, and it provides a certain amount of protection for the neighbors who sometimes have second thoughts about having strangers walking through their backyard. After the long stretch through Chelmsford, the railroad line cut the corners of Westford and Carlisle within a single mile. But 19th century Carlisle wasn't about to pass up a good opportunity. This sturdy little depot, complete with handy privy, handled passengers and railway express alike. We come to the intersection of routes 225 and 27 at the edge of Westford, and there the trail abruptly stops for the moment. If you look very closely on the other side, you can see the hints of where the rail bed continues. In its heyday, North Acton was a busy industrial stretch of town. The railroad ran beside Neshoba Brook, past the Acton pencil factory and its sawmill, and later construction businesses continued to line the route. The North Acton station fielded enough business for a prosperous passenger depot and a separate freight station across the tracks. Then the line crossed Main Street for freight delivery and pickup at one of their best customers. Rex Lumber Company was such an important client that the nearly defunct F&L was still sending freight cars from Framingham to North Acton as late as the 1990s. Trying to find the rail bed as it proceeds south through Acton is easier said than done. According to old maps, the tracks are supposed to cross this side street somewhere. That's 27 out in front of us. But as we cruise down the street, it's not obvious where that might be, unless you use a little creative imagination and look at that ridge to the left. That's the rail line. It was just chopped away when it wasn't useful anymore. The trail that we lost in North Acton reappears where it crosses Route 2A, complete with the railroad crossing signs, the telephone pole that is probably one of hundreds.
We want to keep those because the telegraph was so important. They used the telegraph all the time.
On the south side of 2A, the tracks continue into the woods. Farther down the way, the tracks emerge again from the jungle of bittersweet and other happily self-introduced ground covers near Neshoba Brook. The tracks make their way out of the woods. hint at their existence across the roadway and disappear even more thoroughly into the underbrush beyond. But not for long. This double track lies behind the Bursaw Gas and Oil Company, founded in 1915, whose oil was delivered by railroad car well into the 50s. Bursaw is just the longest survivor of what used to be a thriving industrial center here in East Acton. This was the home of Weatherby's Mills. There was a depot here and a post office, a sawmill, a textile mill. Today it's a little hard to believe, but the water still spills over the dam, and the newer house across the way is built on the foundation of the factory. Back in 1871, the F&L track was a breeze to lay across most of Concord. Farm fields, an occasional grade crossing. One of the grade crossings, though, turned into Route 2 in the 1950s. Where the tracks emerge from the woods again, they proceed to cross, or did cross, the highway. And there they are, right in the middle. Only the rail trail is planning to put on a pedestrian overpass to carry walkers and bikers and dogs across this always busy highway. Acres of green agricultural fields with an edging of stray apple trees, grand old oaks, and maples together comprise one of the largest chunks of undeveloped land in Concord. The Department of Corrections farmland, the wooded surround. It's a grand area to have a trail run through in the 21st century, and despite the almost constant background noise of traffic, it is a beautiful place to be. South of the reformatory, the tracks run straight on a broad thoroughfare. This is the approach to Concord Junction, the site of constant train action in its heyday from the 1870s to the 1950s and beyond. In West Concord, Ralph Warner made a name for himself, Warnerville, in fact, based on his long-standing use of the mill pond nearby and, equally important in the long run, his ownership of the pond's entire shoreline and hundreds of abutting acres. Warner's West End Land Company developed residential and commercial blocks surrounding the new junction to serve employees of the rail lines and the reformatory, as well as the industries shipping and receiving by rail. But not to be outdone in real estate, Benjamin Derby, whose compact farmstead conveniently sat next to the depot, bought up almost all the pastoral landscape that stretched between the junction and the Assabet River. He laid out 109 small house lots, and by 1906, the Derby Division was well under construction, expanding West Concord Village to the banks of the Assabet. The industries that profited from the railroads varied over the years. Commercial ice, woodenware, livestock, harness makers, soon the Allen Chair Company and the foundry.
The foundry was built in 23. Sand casting foundry, so they brought in sand as well as their product was all sand casted, iron wheels, pulleys for the sheet metal industry.
Henry and Jeffrey and I had talked about there being sort of an interpretive center in the area of the junction.
Yes, at the Neshoba crossing, there is an intent to tell more of the story of West Concord and the junction.
That bridge is going to be rebuilt over Neshoba?
We're going to try to use as much as we can of what exists. We're planning to have benches, a seating area, so that people can take a break, can sort of orient and enjoy the open space and just get a sense of what might have been.
The tracks are all coming together at Concord Junction. Trains would have been moved up to the switching yards at the Concord Depot, switching yards that are no longer there. Some of the tracks mysteriously disappear before they even get to the street. But the main crossing is remembered in Junction Park, while MBTA tracks and the National Register listed depot building are lively with 21st century uses. South of the village, the rail bed is swallowed by the woods, where it crosses the Assabet once again, only to briefly reappear as a frame for a dormant cornfield. Then into the woods again. But this is woods that wasn't woods so long ago. A 1915 survey found meadow and cultivated acres, sprout land, new growth, and scrub along this stretch. Continuing south past White's Pond and into Sudbury is some of the most interesting landscape on the F&L line.
There's a blue heron rookery there. We've heard that there are owls living in some of the trees. People have discovered and seen some fabulous wildlife in the area. It's such a different environment that you don't always get to experience
On the roads.
on the roads. Right?
Yeah. Drive into Sudbury, and you'll find a town dominated by river and steeped in history. The Boston and Maine rail line that runs east to west follows that river, but the F&L line slices through the heartland, north to south. It slips by the once busy North Sudbury neighborhood and skirts the town center where train tracks now straddle full-grown trees. South Sudbury, though, was and still is a commercial center, with a handful of small mills in the old days, and most affected by the railroad, a burgeoning greenhouse industry. Coal was delivered to the modern hot houses, out-of-season asparagus, strawberries, delicate flowers were shipped to sophisticated cities. The Cavicchio family's nursery and greenhouses, in business since 1910, still maintain 150 acres of this industry, first made possible by a railroad. South Sudbury, once a thriving railroad junction, has turned its work over to the highways, and even the tracks have been removed between here and Framingham Center. The abandoned railbed crosses Sudbury's South Meadow, now developed but only recently still agricultural land, and then crosses into Framingham, where it cuts straight through residential neighborhoods, and it's clear that the bed itself has been used since then as a welcome local recreational area. Near the north line of Framingham, a wishful land speculation resulted in the Knobscott Station as a stop-off point for day trippers on Knobscott Hill. In 1871, the F&L line joined the earlier Boston and Albany downtown, as well as 4 other branch railroads, to provide rail transport in every direction of the compass. Framingham's town seal commemorates the wheel of the lines that brought prosperity here. It's 1880. South Framingham is bustling. Tracks curving north lead to a big industrial complex at Saxonville, and one of them is the route of the F&L. The pink fan on a map is a brick roundhouse, and in front of it, Curtis Barber's impressive hat factory. A train station sheltered passengers. The freight yards were busy day and night. A Methodist church and a boarding house saw to the welfare of railroad, hat shop, and construction workers, while the Old Colony Hotel served those passing through. By 1885, Framingham was such a hot spot that it called for a new station, modern, and indicative of the powerful conjunction of 6 railroads. Top-tier architect H. Richardson designed a station building both massive and rustic, its interior combining hints of manorial Europe with the stark framing of industrial modern. At that point, there were more than 100 trains a day coming through Framingham, carrying freight, passengers, and mail that was postmarked even as it sped toward its destination. Few signs remain today of the busy working life of this section of town. A 20th century industrial building is still in use. The long, impressive building that was once Mr. Barber's hat factory shows no signs of ever having been here. But the train yards still exist and are still busy. The noise must have been constant for the hat factory people when they worked here. This piece of South Framingham that Mr. Barber developed shows one remnant, the brick building that could have been the office building from his original factory. And next to it, what is at least today an apartment building, a boarding house perhaps. It still retains a taste of the history that was in this area. Beyond the busy train station and the empty industrial quarter, miles of working tracks still exist. Old cars, newer cars, and the unmistakable sound of railroad engines. So what's the big deal about building a rail trail? There's history here.
There's still some of us around that remember the train, you know.
We used to live on the trail, and when there were trains going by, and they went every year, they were a little bit slower, and then one of them fell off the rail bed.
Secluded stretches of green space. You must have spent a lot of time on this trail. Tell me about a favorite.
To be the stretch between Route 27 here and Route 2A. By the river, goes by Neshoba Brook. It's just glorious, and then we'll end up with a bridge over Route 2A. So then you'll have a panoramic view of the area.
I like the Ice House Pond. When you come from the northern part to Ice House Pond at Concord Road and overlooking the pond and the vegetation there, beautiful colors in the fall.
There are bustling intersections and a chance to get outdoors and explore.
West Concord, I just love the pieces of history that remain there and the relationship of the businesses to the former railroad. I think from a transportation perspective, it's really valuable. And it will connect communities, and I really like that feature of it.
However, any project that crosses a whole town, to say nothing of half a dozen towns, obviously faces a lot of challenges. 8 years ago, ground was broken for the first phase of the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail in Chelmsford, a trail that would run from Lowell to Framingham. Today, the 25th of June 2015, ground is being broken again for Phase 2A of a very complicated project.
Roughly $9 million. That's just that piece for which the groundbreaking was. The two major challenges are, over the time that I worked on that, were to overcome the local skeptics that it could ever be done, and then actually proving that it could be done and working through the roller coaster of federal funding, and state funding, and local funding to get the pieces into place.
I know that you must have encountered a number of issues besides trying to get the route across Route 2.
The most challenging thing that we've had to deal with is how to cross the commuter rail line.
F&L neighbors, the abutters, come in two different flavors: commercial industrial and residential. Both groups clearly have immediate and long-range issues. In Acton, for instance, Bursa Oil incorporated railbed clearing with their own recent commercial site renovations. But they still need to find new space for the trucks that have parked in the abandoned track area for years. Framingham's section of the route is still privately owned by CSX, which has so far given little indication of wanting to sell. In Sudbury, Cavicchio Nurseries owns and uses the land on both sides of the railbed. A constant parade of pickups and semis crosses the route where the trail is likely to go.
Cavicchio's, what other problems they have can be mitigated.
Rex Lumber, for instance, the old railroad right-of-way, or the existing railroad right-of-way, went through the middle of their industrial operation. We were able to work together to come up with an alternate route that doesn't interrupt their operation, provides a safer trail.
The residents who abut the trail are going to experience change, and people seem to have a really hard time understanding what that change will mean for them and for their property.
The Bruce Freeman Rail Trail has been and continues to be a very difficult project. Social impacts, major environmental impacts, economic impacts of a 26-mile-long trail take a long time to sort out. It's 30 years so far, and we're nowhere near the end of the project. But as one very patient observer said to me, all good things take time. That, at least, is true.
The staff at Mass DOT, the people who worked with us on this rail trail were phenomenal.